Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about how Project 2025 is seemingly becoming a reality. My guest for this is David A. Graham. David Graham is a journalist. He covers politics and national affairs for The Atlantic magazine, and he is the author of the forthcoming book. It's called The Project: How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. David Graham, it's a good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
It's my honor.
I'm just going to admit right here at the top that I am one of those people who didn't take Project 2025 that seriously in the previous year during the campaign. My thought was, well, these political think tanks, they always come out, especially if they're aligned to one of the two ruling political parties, they always come out with their transition plans and what they want to see from the new administration. And it's always a little bit crazy. It's full of their biggest ideas to the extreme. If they were in their fantasy world and all of this could come true, this is what it would look like. But in reality, over the last 40 years, a lot of it doesn't actually ever become policy in the process of ruling. And then never on top of that, Donald Trump in the campaign even talked despairingly about Project 2025, said he never read it, said there were parts of it he really disagreed with. And so that was my take last year, is this is just something that's being used as a lot of hype. And well, now I think I was wrong. How did Project 2025, I'm not the only person, but how did Project 2025 go from being this just sort of, this has been happening since the Reagan years in the 80s from right-wing think tanks. How did it go from being sort of this, policy kind of, something you might even do just for funders, into aggressively being enacted in policy? What differentiates this from previous kind of papers like this?
I think part of it is simply circumstances. You have a president here who comes in without a lot of interest in policy, and that was true in 2016, and it's true again now. He has certain impulses and certain things he cares a lot about, but the nitty-gritty of policy is just never something that Trump has been all that interested in. And so there's kind of an opening for people who have more of an agenda to do that. And one of the things I think is interesting in Project 2025 is the places where they do lay out ideas that kind of conflict with Trump's. So they had a little bit of a blank slate to work with. The other thing is they thought really hard about implementation in a way they hadn't before. You read these platforms in the past, and I think you're not alone in that. And I think you're exactly right to say that these things are really common. We see them all the time, and most of the time they are kind of bluster. Some of those things go through, but they're the things you would expect. There are certain things that any Democratic administration is going to pursue, any Republican administration is going to pursue. But the folks who designed this had been really frustrated by their experience in the first Trump administration. And they had experienced that, they were frustrated by civil servants, although that's a long-running concern for a lot of conservatives. They were also really frustrated with the political appointees in the first Trump administration, who they felt were sort of lazy or hangers-on, or, maybe representatives of the old Bush mindset. They weren't really on the Trump team, and they were happy to slow walk things. And so they had this sense that if they got back into power, they needed to change things in a really drastic way. And they laid out methods of doing that. And they thought about that in a way that I think we haven't seen in other places. And I think that's why Project 2025 is different. And I think it's why they're having maybe a little bit more success, and why they may continue to have success in the coming months in implementing some of the things that they talk about.
I mean, one key to take it seriously last year, and this was known, was that many people who were participating in Project 2025, and it's a big group project, sort of led by the Heritage Foundation. But one key that maybe you want to take this a little bit more seriously was just the number of former Trump administration officials who are participating in it. And lo and behold, many of these same officials are back in the Trump administration again. Tell me about the folks who are back in this administration again.
Yeah, I mean, like roughly a quarter of the contributors had served in the first Trump administration, and then back now you have somebody like John Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA. You have just a whole range. I mean, there's folks who served at not in household names, but people who served in the Trump Justice Department and in other places who are now back in the administration. There's a guy named Adam Candeob, who's a law professor who's now the general counsel of the FCC. Really interesting thinker, really very drastic and radical. Not someone you're going to hear a lot about, but somebody who's going to have a lot of power through the Federal Communications Commission. But the person who I think is most important is Russell Vought. And Vought was the head of the Office of Management and Budget at the end of the first Trump administration. And then he sort of the intellectual architect of Project 2025, wrote a chapter, but also helped sort of design things. And now he's back in place as the head of OMB once again. And I think what makes his chapter so interesting and important is he really views OMB as the crux of a lot of this. And OMB is, it's, I say in the book, it's not a backwater. It's important. It's often led by people who are really adept operators, but it hasn't been seen as a kind of tool of partisan warfare. It's a place where you manage the government and you produce an aspirational budget every year. And what Vought's sort of genius was to see we can really totally rework the federal government if we control OMB in the right way. We can fire a lot of civil servants. We can convert them to political appointees. We can use OMB less as a kind of clearinghouse and more as a way to force our will on the other cabinet agencies and on independent agencies. And so he's thought through this a lot, and I think we already see that bearing fruit in how the Trump administration is approaching things.
Understanding the Office of Management and Budget, I think, is important. And a lot of people maybe have never even heard of the OMB, stands for Office Management and Budget, before. And one of the we're still early in the presidency, but one of the earliest controversies is when Russell Vought, as director, he was acting director at the time, I think, of Office of Management and Budget, ordered a freeze of trillions of dollars of spending towards loans and grants to states, local governments, tribal governments. This ended up including a lot of nonprofits, and we're talking potentially trillions of dollars of funding. And the importance of the Office of Management and Budget is this is where, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this is where almost all of the spending goes through. So the White House and then Congress, however it is, comes up with spending plans. It's the role of the Office of Management and Budget, not just to take that money, to make sure it also is done legally within existing law, within other laws that might be contradictory, and you have to sort of figure it out. I mean, it's real sort of nuts and bolts office that is at the heart and instrumental of making sure that government operates.
Right. I mean, so much of what the government does is about the money it spends and also the people it employs. And so this is where the money moves through. They're in charge of sending the money out and making sure it's moving. They're in charge of executing the budgets, and they're in charge of managing the federal workforce, both the political appointees and civil servants. And Vought correctly identified that if you control those, you control the whole federal government. And then the trick is whether there are checks and balances on what you can do with that. And they are determined to test that. I mean, they're pushing back on those checks. Historically, there have been. It appears they're in the law. But Vought thinks that he can get around those. And we see him trying that. We saw that in that funding freeze. And that was actually even before he was confirmed, but it's right out of his playbook. It's something he's talked about in Project 2025 and elsewhere. This idea that the president should be able to impound funds. And it's, this is not something, it's a really radical idea. Impoundment is something that presidents talked about and used occasionally through a lot of American history. And then in the 1970s, Congress, upset about Richard Nixon impounding funds, passed a law that said you cannot do that. We appropriate the money and you have to spend it. And Vought believes that this is unconstitutional, that this law is unconstitutional. And he also sees this as an important way for the president to do what he wants to do. And so there's this idea that the federal government would simply, the executive branch rather, would simply refuse to spend funds that Congress had appropriated, is at the heart of that. And it undermines any idea of Congress having the power of the purse. I mean, Congress can set whatever it wants, but if the president doesn't have to use that money in the way that Congress says, it doesn't really have any power of the purse at all.
It was Russell Vogt. I mean, look, you normally don't even think about the Office of Management and Budget, never mind who is the director of it. It is sort of the quintessential bureaucratic, right, position. I mean, you need somebody, and maybe he is competent, right? I'm not saying he's not. He might be quite competent, but you need someone there who's not just an ideologue. You need someone there who actually understands how policy works, how government works, because it's so key to how government works. But Russell Vogt, wasn't he the one that said that this would be like another 1776 or 1860 moment for the country, a revolutionary moment?
I believe that was Paul Dans who said that, who's the other major leader of this. And it was interesting. I mean, you're right. And I think Vogt is interesting because although we have become accustomed to the idea that a lot of the people who work in the Trump administration are in it for themselves or are sort of, political hacks, Vogt is somebody with a long record. And I think he is very competent, which is one of the other reasons why I think Project 2025 has succeeded maybe where some of these other reports and plans have kind of fallen by the wayside. He worked on Capitol Hill for Phil Gramm, the conservative financial ideologue who helped deregulate the financial industry in the 90s. Then he worked for Jeb Hensarling, another important fiscal conservative. He worked at Heritage. He worked for the Republican Study Committee, which is a sort of major locus of hard conservative thought in Congress. And so he's really steeped in these worlds, and he knows how they work. And that was another one of his frustrations with the administration, the first administration, is he felt like when he got to the White House, the people working there simply weren't of the same caliber that he was used to from Capitol Hill, where there are a lot of people who are low paid but really committed to the cause. He didn't see that, and he wanted to make sure that if they got back into power, there were going to be people who were really committed and who knew what they were doing.
Is there an ultimate goal laid out in Project 2025, especially when it comes to how to use the Office of Management and Budget?
I think it's all about presidential control in one way or another. It is bringing the historically independent regulatory agencies, things like the FCC, the Federal Reserve, under the heel of the White House. It's slashing the federal workforce. It's slashing what the federal government spends. And it's making many more of those federal positions political appointees, so that a president can fire them at will, and he can make everything much more political. I mean, throughout the project, you see arguments that basically that parts of the government are too independent, and that's independent both in a political sense, but also independent. For example, they're too devoted to following science and following rigorous data, and they should be devoted to executing a political goal instead. And so all of these things are designed to do that, to make the president more powerful and able to just direct the federal government kind of at his whim.
There's always has been a feeling, right, that regardless of who, a president only has so much space that they can move the country in one direction or the other. But fundamentally, the country is still going to be moving in the same direction, regardless of the president from either party.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a way in which that's very true. And the civil service is kind of designed that way. This is something we've had since the 1880s. And the problem there was that it was staffed by political hacks. And Congress said enough and instituted a professional staff of people who wouldn't leave every time there was a new president. And that was important partly because the country was growing and the government was growing. And it was much smaller then than it is now. For something of this size to try to replace all these workers and the kind of expertise in the government every 4 or 8 years would be unthinkable. And this is a way in which I think, to your point, like Project 2025 is not really conservative. It is radical. It is very right wing, but it's not conservative. It's about a really drastic change in the way the government and the country works.
That's interesting. I did not know this was sort of an issue for Congress to take up, about the politicization of the bureaucracy, and that's not. I didn't get through your whole book, which I just read it last night, but that's not what your book's necessarily about, and I don't want to ask questions that you're not prepared for. But that it does interest me that this was actually an issue that Congress personally tried to address concerning, I guess, the professionalization of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I mean, it was a patronage system where presidents would appoint people in their party sort of as a favor to them. And the real turning point is that when James Garfield was shot, he was assassinated by a frustrated office seeker. That was kind of the moment when, after years of frustration and many corruption scandals, Congress was ready to change the system and institute a more professional one. And you see, in Project 2025, the authors acknowledge that the motivation for the civil service, but they say it's simply gone too far. There's too many of them, and the president can't move them. They're a kind of built-in resistance. And a lot of presidents have been frustrated with the civil service at times because it doesn't always move as fast as they want. It doesn't do the things they want to do. But I think it's particularly a challenge for a conservative administration or a right-wing administration, partly because there are, federal workers, our surveys show, generally lean left. But also because they're devoted to the law as it stands. And those are things that Trump and Russell Vought and other people in this orbit simply don't want to have to deal with.
Do you think that this is a departure from earlier positions? And sometimes I do wonder that maybe this is just an extreme version of it, because I can't help but think back to the anti-tax crusader, Grover Norquist, who I think said once something to the effect that he'd like to shrink government to the size where he could drown it in the bathtub. And that, in a way, that sort of feels like what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's definitely in that lineage. And some of the things you read in here are pretty standard conservative or right-wing talking points. And some of them are a little bit different. I think particularly the kind of social conservatism in here on a policy basis, it sticks out. But there is a lineage. I mean, this is a connection. And one of the things that I think is most surprising, that Norquist quote, I think, is famous partly because it was him coming out and saying it openly. And often you have people accusing partisans of hiding what they really want to do. And Project 2025 is notable because they not only laid out these really radical plans, but they put it out on the internet 18 months before an election and sort of dared people to read it and take it seriously. And I'm not sure that it totally penetrated, maybe partly because they weren't hiding it, but it's all laid out right there.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with David A. Graham. David Graham is a journalist. He covers politics and national affairs for The Atlantic magazine, and he is also the author of the book, The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. You write about one of the other sort of leading figures of Project 2025 is the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. And I guess Roberts writes that Project 2025 has 4 goals, and I'm quoting what you wrote here: restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children, dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. I think that's kind of that second part there is what we've been harping on so far. Defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats, and secure God-given individual rights to live freely, what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. Let me go to that first one. Tell me about restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. How is that being implemented?
It's a really interesting range of proposals under there. And I think there's some of the ones that we have not felt as much yet, but there's some of the ones that could really shape American life most clearly. The things we've seen already are, for example, the orders from the administration defining sex as male and female with nothing else, attacks on DEI, attacks on trans rights, use of Title IX to insist that trans athletes not compete in girls' sports. And so those are the sort of the simplest ones, the ones that are most straightforward that we've seen already. But they see, they argue for a really wide-ranging redefinition of a lot of things. At the heart is just an idea of a nuclear family with a father who works, a mother who ideally stays in the home with children.
And that's what the Project 2025 says?
Yeah, they advocate very much for male breadwinners. They don't say that women shouldn't work, but they argue that there's a lot of policy changes that should be made to make it easier for mothers to stay home. So, for example, that means paying or for family members to take care of children. So, paying for childcare in the home or finding ways to subsidize childcare in the home so that you only have to have one breadwinner in a family.
I mean, that
then
doesn't sound so terrible. I mean, if you take out the gender aspect, could be the father who stays home. But we now live in a society in which both parents have to work and have to take care of the home as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Some of these things where they overlap even with, Elizabeth Warren wrote years ago, The Two Income Trap, about the difficulty of having to have two parents working. And you see some similarities there. You see other proposals. I mean, the idea of better childcare makes sense. There's a proposal to make it easier for childcare to take place in the office or in a workplace, so that people don't have to go somewhere else where their children are. They can be closer to their children. I mean, these are things that I think might have widespread appeal. There's an argument.
I'm surprised to hear that actually out of.
Oh yeah,
2020.
I mean, there's an argument for, and this is a sort of example of I think a lot of people might be uncomfortable with the kind of religious overtone, but maybe not with the effect, which is they say that there should be a de facto Sabbath for people, so people should be able to take time off work. They shouldn't have to work 7 days. They should have a rest period, and they say the default would be Sunday, but it wouldn't need to be Sunday. For example, it could be a Jewish Sabbath. And if you don't do that, you should have to be paid time and a half. So there's a lot of things that are pro-family in a sense that I think a lot of people would get on board with. And, that's, I think, true throughout Project 2025, where there are elements that are very conservative or very radical. And other ones that I think would appeal to a lot of people across the political spectrum. And they're often just in one paragraph after another right together.
What about on abortion? Are they looking for a national ban?
They are, and they're looking for any way to do that. I mean, there's a bunch of things they'd like to do. First of all, they want to, they want to make sure that you cannot mail abortion pills through the mail. You use the Comstock Act, and this is one of the things that I think got the most attention was this idea of banning that. They want to crack down on abortion other ways. They want a registry of abortions. Everything they can do from the federal government other than passing a congressional ban on abortion, they would like to do. And there are a lot of steps. And then, of course, they would also like to see a congressional ban on abortion.
It's always scary to hear about the Comstock Act. This is an act that was weaponized in the 1950s, known as the Lavender Scare, in which gays and homosexuals in the federal government were fired at large during the communist. It was part of the communist witch hunt at the time. I do want to ask you about the FCC. This is something important to me. I'm of the old media, the radio. The FCC does have jurisdiction over us. My radio network, Pacifica Radio, was named in Project 2025 along with NPR and others. What's happening with the FCC and how this is? We already see the FCC launching investigations both into commercial and public radio station, and just broadcasters in general. What does Project 2025 say about the FCC's role, and how is it so far being implemented?
Yeah, the chapter of Project 2025 written covering the FCC is written by Brendan Carr, who is now the chairman of the FCC, and I think what I see is a broad assault on broadcast media, on any sort of independent broadcast media. So in the case of nonprofit media, Carr believes, we've seen, I guess I should back up. We have seen, of course, efforts by Republicans to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, to defund NPR for a long time, and generally not successful. But Carr is laying out ways to approach this from a regulatory point of view. So, one thing he says is, these stations take, they have sponsors. So, if you're watching PBS, there will be an underwriter, and well, that's a commercial. We believe that's a commercial, and they're not allowed to take commercials under their educational licenses. So we should revoke their educational licenses. So I mean, it's a pincer. They don't want to give public funding, but they also want to make it impossible for these for broadcasters to receive private funding. Through nonprofits and other things. And so Carr has already sent a letter to PBS and NPR asking to investigate those things. Generally, though, what he wants to do is he wants to revoke these licenses that allow Pacifica, NPR, and PBS to broadcast as educational broadcasters. And then in terms of commercial media, there's a whole range of things he would like to do to pressure the traditional for-profit media, corporate media. We've already seen him demanding transcripts of a 60 Minutes interview from CBS. There's an interview with Kamala Harris that Trump has made a big deal about and has sued about. And so here Trump is suing as a private individually suing CBS, and at the same time, his FCC under Brandon Carr is pressuring CBS to produce these transcripts. And I think all of these things I think are an attempt to cow the press, in whatever form, out of critical coverage and out of independent coverage that might make Trump look bad.
And we also see the White House now moving towards picking what journalists will be part of pools, especially when they travel. Is that laid out in Project 2025?
That's not laid out. I mean, that's a different and interesting thing. And it's curious to see what is in Project 2025. I mean, the ideology of cracking down on independent press is very much there, but these questions of sort of how the press room should run are things that they sort of set aside as maybe not of the same kind of caliber of importance policy wise.
They also want to eliminate, and I think this is laid out in Project 2025, sticking with the FCC for a moment, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is the entity that actually gives funds to public broadcasters. Not our network, but that's a long story. But most, NPR especially. And people.
That's right. And it's, the reasoning that they offer here is very blunt. I mean, they simply say, people who consume public broadcasting tend to be, surveys suggest that people who consume public broadcasting lean left, and therefore these must be liberal propaganda networks, and we should defund them and eliminate them. It's bad logic among other things, and I think it's it's an assault on free press.
I mean, it's for us, we don't take corporate underwriting either, and I don't mean to make this about us, but you do see the commercials on PBS, and it's hard. I'm sorry, I do think they are commercials. I don't think they're wrong about that. They're straight commercials. But what's also left out is the erosion of government support and cuts over the years that has actually led to that dynamic.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, and there's I think it is a pincer in that way. They're trying to pressure the broadcasters from both directions.
Yeah, so they basically cut the broadcasters for many years, forcing and then liberalized the broadcasters' ability to take corporate underwriting, and then they did that in part because they had to, and now that they're doing that, they're being punished again because they just don't like, these people just don't like public broadcasting.
Exactly.
Do you find an overall, well, let me ask about democracy, right? Because this is something that's up for debate. People say democracy is at risk right now. This fears that this is the end of the democratic system. I think, and I want to know if this is laid out in Project 2025 about their idea about democracy, because there is another argument to it of like, no, this is democratic. Donald Trump won the election. He should have control from winning the election over how the executive branch operates. This is actually more democratic than having this bureaucratic state limiting what a president who is the head of the executive branch can do.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting question, and that's very, very much the attitude that they take. Is they say, why is there this huge crowd of people who can slow walk what the president does? Like, the president is elected. He should be able to control the executive branch. And I think there is some truth to that. I wouldn't want to write that off entirely, but I think it's a really one-sided view of things. And what it leaves out is Congress, most of all. When we talk about, for example, independent agencies, they want to get rid of independent agencies. And they believe it's unconstitutional. But we know that, and that's, I suppose, a question for the courts, and they very much want to get test cases to the court and hope that they can get the Supreme Court to side with them. But the law very clearly said, the laws passed by Congress very clearly say that, for example, these are independent agencies. Congress has passed laws that lay out the protections for the civil service, for people working for the federal government. And they take this idea that, basically, only the president should have power, only the executive branch. And it's interesting. I mean, when you read it, you read that quote from Kevin Roberts about sort of, about returning power to the people. And in the report, they say, one problem is that Congress has yielded too much power over the years to the executive branch. They've yielded those things by basically assigning roles to departments, by asking the executive branch to implement parts of laws that they don't lay out entirely. That's a critique that I think a lot of people agree with. There is a sense that Congress is not doing its job on any number of things. But what's bizarre is that Project 25's answer to that is, therefore, the president should have even more power. He should be able to run roughshod over the things that Congress has done. He should be able to sort of do all of these things, regardless of whether the laws are in place. And so I think that's a sort of a contradiction that I don't see explained in Project 2025, and I think it's a real difficulty with their argument. It's democratic in a very blunt sense, but it is not the kind of existence of rule of law and checks and balances that, I certainly wouldn't say they always function in the American system, but I think that balance is, of course, something that many of us have always thought is one of the most important things about the American Constitution. And I don't see a lot of reverence for that in this document.
What about the ignoring of judges' orders?
They're not as direct on that as we've seen recently. But it's part of the same idea. I mean, when they say they're ignoring these orders, or they threaten to ignore these orders, or say they don't always have to respond to them, as we've seen some nominees doing, they're really buying into the same idea that there's simply unconstitutional limits on what the executive can do, and they believe the Supreme Court will side with them.
But they're making a decision that no, the judge's ruling's unconstitutional. So we're making
right. They think they have the right to decide that the judge's ruling is unconstitutional, and that's another example of where the checks and balances that I think many of us have been taught for many years exist are being put into really direct question.
And then there's the firing of the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's the replacement of the JAG attorneys, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the top military person. And the firing of all these people within the Justice Department. Is there a philosophy behind that?
I think there's a couple things going on. In the case of the military firings, there's an idea throughout Project 2025 that the military has become too, quote unquote, woke, which isn't something they really describe, but it's very much the view. They complain that this is, they say, Barack Obama's officer corps. And they suggest, without really offering a lot of evidence, that these people have been promoted simply because they are on the right political agenda, or because of the color of their skin, or because of their gender. And so you see this in the firing of C.Q. Brown, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a heavily decorated black general, and who's now been replaced by a less retired and less high-ranking white general. So there's this real concern about DEI throughout, and in particular about the sort of quote-unquote wokeness, and social engineering in the military is something they're very concerned about. When we look at the Justice Department, I think it is more simply about power. It's a concern that the Justice Department acts as a quasi-independent body, a little bit like these independent agencies, but within the executive branch. And that the president should be able to tell them what to do. I mean, the attorney general is appointed by the president. Why can't the president do what he wants? And, the answer to that is we have seen dangerous corruption at the Justice Department when presidents have had too much power over it. We saw Nixon trying to use the Justice Department to his own ends. And that's why there are rules. They're not laws, but they're rules that make the Justice Department act in an independent way. And they want to get rid of that. They want the Justice Department to work, hand in glove with the White House. And that means not simply, that can mean, pushing a policy agenda, but it can also mean retribution against enemies of the president, as we're seeing.
Again, your forthcoming book is How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. I think this comes out in April.
That's right, April 22nd.
Somebody who's paid a great amount of attention to Project 2025, as you must, to write a book about it. What are you looking for here in the future? What do you think is still to come?
I think the stuff about gender and family roles is really important, and we have not seen all of that. I think we still have a lot to see about what they'll do about labor. That's a real focus in here, and you see a little bit of the more maybe quasi-populist side of the new Republican Party. It's not friendliness to labor unions, but it's a little bit less animosity, and there are steps to really check corporate power and to try to put some power in the hands of workers, which I think are really intriguing.
How so?
It's interesting. They say we should antagonize unions, where a lot of Republican administrations have said have specifically set out to antagonize unions. But what they want to do is they want to make sure there are things like workers' councils, which are a little bit of a watered down version. And they want to make it easier for people to organize, which has not historically been a Republican idea. Now, there are different factions within the administration. So on the one hand, you see this idea that we should antagonize unions and we should make it easier to organize. On the other hand, one of the first moves the administration made was to fire the very pro-labor general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. So we'll see where their actions go on that. And then one other thing maybe is environment. I mean, across the board, the focus on energy and the environment is finding ways to drill, baby, drill, to knock down any kind of research, any kind of protections, any efforts along the lines of climate change, really in a very sweeping way. To privatize science, to make NOAA less of a public agency, to close a lot of the important research that we've seen. And so I think that's really important, and that's something that's going to take time. But if they're successful, could be very dangerous for the country and have an impact for decades to come, even if some of these other things get changed back.
David A. Graham has been our guest. Again, David Graham's a journalist. He covers politics and national affairs for The Atlantic magazine, and he is the author of the forthcoming book that he generously joined us to talk about before it's actually out. It's called The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. David Graham, I thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.